All right, Ariana. Well, a lot of people probably already know us from the storytelling lab, um, but let's go ahead and get into this conversation because one of the questions that I get all the time from students who are applying for fellowships in the UK is, can you help me understand the difference, like in general, between UK structure of education and their degree programs and how that might map onto ours? I'm trying to figure that out. So given that you are a Marshall Scholar and have pursued a degree in the UK and education in the UK, I thought you'd be a perfect person to help us answer some of those questions. So however
Yeah,
you want to enter into that discussion.
yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. Because yeah, this is a really big question that I had when I was coming into Marshall,
Mhm.
because one of the things that you do a lot of when you're applying to whether it's Marshall, Rhodes, Fulbright, that is a UK, US Fulbright, is you spend a lot of time researching these degrees, but the information and the websites and how they do things in the UK are very different. So if you're researching a grad degree in the United States, you're going to go to the faculty page. You're going to see what the faculty interests are, right? You're going to try to find someone to work with that aligns with yours. A lot of these UK university websites don't really work like that. So in the US, grad school is more based on who you're going to work with. In the UK, it's more based on the specific taught course or the research course, because who you're going to work with can change from year to year. In my current year, the person that I applied to work with at Goldsmiths, I haven't even met him. He has not been there all year. So it's actually really what you need to pay attention to is the structure of the course. And there are typically two kinds of master's level courses, and then I'll get into the PhD ones. But for masters, there's two big sections. There's the taught courses. Those have classes, and those are split into kind of trimesters, right? So you start with fall, and then you go to winter, and then you go to spring, and you're taking different courses in each of those. And then in the summer, you're writing your thesis. So you're wrapping up your degree, but you're actually going to class. You're taking courses with the course convener, which is usually the person who teaches the main big course that makes up the degree, and maybe one or two electives, but you're taking classes. There's also the research MAs that some of my cohorts did that didn't have classwork. So that's where you are working one-to-one with a specific professor to complete research, whether that's within your, specific discipline that was already established, whether that's working under them to learn their discipline, but your goal is to write a big paper at the end. No classes, just one-to-one. And the taught ones are more common. I did two taught courses because my work was creative writing and I wanted to be in a workshop space. But I know people who had already significant experience, maybe working in lab, for example, did research courses where they went to lab every day and they were doing robotics things and engineering things and not taking classes. So those are kind of the two big classes of degree. And then, of course, with the PhD, it's similar to the United States, where you start out with coursework and then switch to independent research. So that's pretty similar.
Okay. Because even what they're called is different though, right?
Yeah.
And so, right, like how do you figure that out? Like, I mean, is the approach to begin in the United States and kind of see what maps on? I mean, is that generally what people do?
That's what I did. I started out actually, and this wasn't necessarily intentional. This was just because I had not really known much about Marshall. So I was looking into MFAs in the United States. And then from there, I was like, well, what would be the equivalent of an MFA in the UK? So I think that's a pretty good strategy. If you're looking at, doing some kind of master's in the United States,
Mhm.
trying to figure out what the UK correlate would be might help you narrow down what a good program would be for you, what a good school would be for you. I realized that there were really only one or two actual MFAs, which was the terminal degree on the master's level in the UK. And so I realized, okay, so I'll look into MAs, which is a master's of arts. There's also masters of philosophy, there's masters of science. All of that kind of means similar things, just under different disciplines. It's not that you're getting a different level of degree.
Okay. And I mean, did you find the sort of like the way you imagined the way that the course experience would be was like what it actually was, or was there a big difference in terms of what professors expected and what you were prepared to give? How did that work?
Well, honestly, I didn't have much of an imagination of it once I
Okay.
came. I was just because it all seemed so different from the website to the way that they did the interview to my interactions with the professor. So I was just kind of going in not really knowing what to expect. Um,
Mhm.
but in hindsight, it is pretty different. And I think there's a couple of key things, especially when you're coming out of undergrad, that make it different.
Mhm.
One, there are far less assignments, far
Mhm.
less. You will not have a little homework, you will not have quizzes. If you're in any kind of humanities, I would be shocked if you have a test.
Mhm.
Even a few of the sciences, I would be really shocked if you have more than one exam. And that's the thing. So there's less assessment, right, which is can result in less work. It does feel to me less intensive than United States study. Um, it also means that the things that you are graded on are weighted much heavier. So you, in one class, you could maybe have two things that you get graded on. That's your entire grade for the whole class that you take for that term. It could be a paper and a project, two papers, and they also sometimes do this thing called formative and summative assessment.
Mhm.
So formative might be what you turn in at the midway point, that is the first draft or version of your project. And then
Mhm.
the summative is what they actually grade. And they give feedback on the formative so that you can adjust and really learn, which I like because that's kind of the way that I grew up understanding education is you start, you try, you get feedback, you adjust it to be the best version that it can be.
Yeah, that's pretty much what graduate school is like in the United States, though. I mean, like,
Yeah.
so like you don't do a lot of work. I mean, in terms of like what you might do as an undergraduate. So you might have,
Yeah, that's what I meant as an undergraduate. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, like so graduate school in the United States. I mean, I never like I had maybe one class where you had like every week you had to turn in like a 2-page paper, but we
Mhm.
like it was a history class, but and you might have to read like 2 or 3 books, about 20 articles, and then you have to
Mhm.
write
Yep,
2-page papers.
yep.
And then as a part of the training for US graduate students is that you would then have to usually sign up for 2 presentations, which would mean
Mm,
you had to carry that 3-hour class.
right.
That's what you
Yeah.
did, you know?
Yeah, so I don't think the presentations weren't a big part of my project, but there were also outside things that I had to do. I
Mhm.
did a script writing thing this year, so we had to do a pitch panel. And that's another thing too that I like about the UK study. It's highly professionalized. So they're really trying to encourage you to interact with people from your field. They're often bringing in people from your field that will come to class that you might have to present or talk about your ideas with, which was helpful.
Okay, okay. And I mean, you definitely feel like, I mean, you grew a lot. It was a valuable experience for you. Um, and you really like the way you described it to me, it was intense, but very rewarding.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was learning how to get from that deadline directed
Mhm.
work to that self-directed work so that all your paper isn't due within a week and you let it go.
Yeah.
So learning how to write a little bit every week, learning how to do a little bit of research every week, and really kind of adjust your kind of schedule because some courses I only went to class once a week and then for the rest of the week it's on you. And you really, which is also I think a benefit of studying internationally because then you get to explore the city and you get to travel,
Yeah.
but that means you have to use your time wisely so that you
Yeah.
don't come down to the wire at the last minute like I did the first semester and
Okay.
sit in the library at midnight trying to squeeze out a last paper.
Yeah. Well, and then like, I mean, just from our work together, the thing that I say to students is that if you want to win these awards, I do think that it helps when you are driving your research and trying to understand these structures and these institutions so that you are your own expert, right? Because it just helps your application process and I think your prospects when you're
Yeah.
invested in it, in doing the work yourself of learning about these various structures. I mean, because you were very knowledgeable when we would talk about the process.
Yeah, I mean, because I was able to say, hey, I want to go to Royal Holloway because it has a really strong history of being a creative writing school, because this poet is there, Kay Miller, who has a Jamaican background and talks about work in diaspora and
Mhm.
history, which is work that aligns with mine. So you really, once you get into the nitty gritty, it might be a little tougher because some of these UK websites aren't as up to date. But once you find names, ideas about places that you might want to study. If Liverpool and that history is really important to you, that's an interesting place to study, right? So once you get into that research, that fortifies your application times 1,000, because they're not necessarily looking for anything, off the wall, dynamic, unique from everybody, because every discipline is not like that. What they are
Yeah,
looking for is specificity and clarity.
yeah,
Why are you going here? What do you want from this institution? How can we help you get it? And so
yeah.
that, I think, was something that I was really, really focused on when choosing schools.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, like, so if I were teaching a class if it was a fellowship class, I were teaching a fellowship class, that's what I would do. Like, I wouldn't, as the instructor, feel like I needed to know everything about all of these institutions in the world.
Yeah,
I would
no,
think that my job would be to teach the student how to ask the right questions. Because what happens is once you get to graduate school, what you realize is that that's what everyone did. I mean,
exactly,
so, right,
exactly.
like, I mean, people who are at these institutions are people who looked into that for themselves.
Yep.
So, right, like a part of what you're trying to change is the consumer mindset that I just go to someone and they give me all the answers,
Yep.
and
No, I
that's
did a
what
lot of research. I had a spreadsheet of, US and UK schools, because at the time, getting a Marshall isn't a given. So I had both. And I looked up top creative writing programs. Then I looked up the cities that they were. And I said, oh, I probably want to live in London. So I narrowed it down a bit further from there. And then I said, oh, I think I really do want to study, poetry, but maybe experimental. And so then I looked at poetry programs that were less traditionally focused. And so that allowed me to eliminate, an Oxford, a Cambridge, an East Anglia that might have been really, really traditionally focused, and find a poetic practice program that was experimental. And that's the other thing about these UK degrees, they're so highly specified. I know people who got a master's on a Marshall in comic book design. You can really
wow.
find a degree that is exactly what you want to be studying. They're out there. You just have to
Yeah.
do the research.
Yeah. Now that's certainly the case for Marshall. What about with Oxford?
Yeah, so Rhodes is a bit of a different game. I would say if you're looking into Rhodes, be sure that you know that you want to go to Oxford first, and make sure you know what degree you want to study. And again, that's looking into the scholars, seeing kind of what their work is, but really looking at the course. And they're really good about putting the course structures up, about putting example classes on the website, so that you can really kind of get an imagination of what you would be doing there.
Okay.
For me, Oxford was less of a better option, because again, it was really traditional creative writing. But
Mm.
I know that the people who have had success at Oxford have done things in political science, who've done things in STEM, and were able to find a course and an advisor that really, really matched their interest. So when you're applying to Rhodes, it's approach it similarly. Find the degree first, make sure that you think this would be the right option, because
Mhm.
Rhodes is much more constricted than Marshall, right? You only do Oxford study. PhDs are also an option through the Rhodes. It is a bit more difficult to get a Rhodes PhD
Mhm.
funded without experience in, a little bit of other areas. Like, you have to really, really strong research, but it's possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and I think that's really good advice too. I mean that, right, like some students don't quite understand. Like there's this fellowship that's sort of new that can get you to Oxford,
Yeah.
and they sort of like made it clear like they want to win a road. That's not an easy thing to do.
No, it's so
Yeah,
hard for a reason. And I mean, even once you get to the finalist stage, there are all of
yeah,
these procedures that you go through with the interview. You go to somebody's house, you have drinks before, and that's a pre-interview interview. That's not just
yeah,
casual drinks. They're sizing
yeah,
you up from that first moment.
yeah.
There are a lot of different steps to making sure you get the road. There are a lot of letters of recommendation, right? It's 8. You have to get those letters in, no exceptions. Marshall has a little wiggle room with that they don't necessarily publicize. If
Okay.
something happens to your fourth Marshall letter, they're not going to throw your application out. I
Yeah.
don't know if that's the same for roads.
Yeah.
So yeah, just keeping all of those
Yeah.
things in mind.
Yeah. And I imagine that they would because it's so
Yeah.
competitive. You know,
It's
it's
so they're looking for ways to eliminate people.
that's right.
And it's really hard, it's really tough, but unfortunately, 3.74 or whatever is not 3.8. 3.79 is not 3.8. And so
Yeah.
unfortunately, they're looking for things to eliminate. So it's not that you're, not worthy, not a great candidate. It's that
Yeah.
literally it's so competitive. They don't have time to course needle in a haystack go through every single application. So
That's it.
sometimes you're just getting weeded out based on bigger categories.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I have one more question. I used to watch these vlogs of, well, in watching the vlogs, I got to sort of get a sense of like different culture of these universities in the UK. And like one that I really liked, that young woman went to Cambridge. And so they used to have to bring formal wear. And the student that I know who went to Oxford, they had to bring formal wear as well. Did you have it? Was that a part of your experience too? That there were these
Was
formal?
not.
Okay.
That's one of those very, very old traditions that you kind of
Okay.
only get at Cambridge and Oxford. And that's partly because the schools are their own little cities. And that's another thing I wanted to bring up when mentioning Cambridge and Oxford.
Mhm.
So when you're applying to Oxford, you're not only applying to your degree that you want to do, you're also applying to a specific college within the college that is Oxford, right? So there's Magdalen, that's when a lot of my friends went to. There are different levels of prestige associated with the certain colleges. Some of them have to do with certain disciplines. A lot of the art students go in one college, the STEM students go in another, but you have to apply to get into these colleges, even as you're applying for the degree. And it works similarly at Cambridge. So those schools are kind of structured a little bit differently. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think that's where some of the old tradition comes from.
Yeah.
I got to go to a Cambridge ball and see, the inside of the schools and all the really, cool hallowed grounds. And you can see why they run things a little bit differently.
Because that's actually something that I'd be interested in doing at Spelman, right? Like, introducing this. I have this whole vision for this program that I'm calling Occasions in my head. And it would involve, formal wear.
Yeah,
And that used to be a part of an educated person's, experience.
yeah.
And,
Well, and I think that's something that trips people up in the roads interview a lot is that cocktail hour. What do
right.
you wear? What do I say? How do I go get my drink and eat and sit
Yeah.
down and converse? And where do
Yeah.
I jump in? That really does require practice. And the successful Rhodes scholars and the
Mhm.
schools that produce the Rhodes every year do have all their applicants practice that cocktail hour. They don't
Yeah.
go in unprepared.
They don't go in cold.
Yeah.
And so, and it would be, I mean, it would be something that I would do. Cause like, I mean, there was a time when for African American people,
Yeah.
everything like, anything beyond Black space was a minefield.
Yeah.
And so like you were preparing yourself for all those different occasions.
Yeah.
And so within Black spaces, there was this way in which, like there were aspects of formality and culture that you learn in your church.
Yeah.
And I think that there are ways that we can draw from our broader culture to create that. And I'm very interested in like, 'cause you have all those kids who are on campus for summer programs.
Yeah.
I would love to be able to touch people in that way, but
That would be really helpful. It's a common practice to one of those things that I just didn't know until I met, my Marshall cohort, where they would say, yeah, we would be invited if we wanted to have dinner with, the deans and
right,
to, sit down and, do a little cocktail hour with, the president or different visiting faculty. And so they got that practice at
yeah,
those events. That
yeah,
was something that I didn't personally have experience with Spelman to a very high degree that I think could really be integrated into, the programs there. And that would really
yeah,
serve as a kind of stepping stone for something like
yeah.
that.
Yeah, I mean, and it like when we talked, like that was the first time I knew that, like I just in my head, like all the presidentials had at some point gone through votes. And when you said you hadn't, I'm like, so I said to Miss Cook just reached out to the office to see if because now you're not guaranteed to have a presidential and be in honors. And
Oh, okay.
yeah, so I don't know if I'm still over that that experience.
Gotcha.
And so I asked if like we're trying to figure that out. And if
Yeah,
it
that would
is,
have been really nice.
yeah, and if it is, right, like that's one of the
That's
things
a
that
great
I like
opportunity.
in structuring, right?
Yeah,
You
and I
know,
did, and I did learn a bit from those presidential dinners. I did, or those presidential luncheons. Growing each one, probably freshman year, I only spoke once, and by senior year, I would bring up topics of conversation with Dr.
yeah,
Campbell. And so that was a
yeah.
good stepping stone. But there are only 20 presidential scholars, so this has to be something that we can expand beyond just that really small group.
Yeah, which is like why I'm thinking, because a part of like what the summer would do is that it would mean that people could have a signature Spelman experience that sort of imagines the possibilities for where these young Black women could go.
Yeah,
And the world, like
yeah.
we're imagining that, right, like that you could be anywhere.
Yeah.
And so
It gives you a tangible idea of what you can be as a Spelman woman. Because
that's
I
it.
think oftentimes that archetype is too abstract. And you see
I
these
agree.
pictures and you see names and faces and you think, okay, I
Yeah,
have to emulate that. But you don't even see the substance of what they've done to get there. And
that's
so
it.
having those conversations, interacting with people in that substantive way, I think will
Yeah.
really see, okay, this is what I can be. This is how I can model myself as a Spelman woman.
Yeah, and it's not like what it looks like on TV. Like so I was friends with this girl. I used to work with these girls and at the student center where I had been an assistant student manager.
Mm.
And we were all in sororities. But they had sorority houses. We didn't have a sorority house.
Yeah.
And so like as we talked about it, the girl was like, "Oh, you should come over. I would love to have you over for dinner." Well, dinner in their sorority house was a formal affair. So
Yes.
like, like so even the thing, like so there was a dorm mother,
Yep.
and a part of being respectful at the table was that you couldn't talk about alcohol. So you
Mhm.
had to call it, I think they called it Kool-Aid or punch if you were referring to alcohol. And
Uh,
so there was this way that there was this training that
yes.
I had never been, and I went to
Yep.
private school,
Yep.
but I wasn't in circles that would have done that. Like I've been in circles where everyone had to say a Bible verse,
Yeah,
okay?
exactly. Yeah.
But not where that polite conversation at the dinner table
Right. Which is
meant that
different than public speaking.
it's
Polite
different.
conversation is a very different skill than public speaking.
And yes, and so what that entails.
Yeah.
And I think that getting the experience where you literally have to dress and show up for it
Yeah.
is different from, an etiquette class. That
Absolutely.
can
Yeah.
be
No.
just silly.
Yeah. No, 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 no.
Yeah,
It's about the conversation. It's not about your physical, how you carry yourself, your behavior. That's a little bit part of it, but that's basic and silly, and people can Google that.
that's
But the idea of having a substantive conversation, having something to say, how to join the dialogue, being well read on current
yeah,
events so that you can contribute to conversations when people bring up things that have happened in the news,
that's
things like
it. Yeah. I mean, and so because a part of my occasions thing would be, you'd go to the High
that.
Museum and
Yeah.
what it like, how much time you might like give to a painting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then having conversation in that space, dressing for that space, depending on the occasion for even that. Because
Yeah.
there are different occasions inside of museums.
Exactly. And that's something too that I think I remember doing, not intentionally as part of my Marshall preparation, but just I felt like, okay, a person going into the world who wants to be well read, but as a senior, I don't have time to read as much as I want. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I have a really, really specifically curated podcast section that allowed me to catch up on news, allowed me to learn about different, things that were going on culturally,
Mhm.
art, poetry. And I would just do it when I was walking around campus, walking to and from class, the gym. And so I didn't feel nervous when I had to have conversation about current events, or I had to say, oh, well, what are you interested in? And I could talk about art and I could talk about ballet because I had listened to all of these people professionally talking about it on a recording. And I
Yeah.
felt that there were things that I could emulate. So that's something
Yeah.
that I would recommend for students who are looking to apply to prestigious fellowships,
Yeah.
podcasts.
That's absolutely right. And also, I think developing an interest in your friends, particularly like who are involved in sort of cultural majors.
Yes.
And so, even if you think I'm not interested in ballet, support your friend who's a ballerina. So like, if you
Absolutely.
go to those things, so like if you like you watch vlogs of these kids who go to Ivy League schools, it
Yep.
is a habit of being in those spaces that they
Yep.
take advantage of theater and museum and dance performance, live music performance. They go
Yeah.
and
That's actually a huge part of my experience. My best friend Kayla is an art historian. I came to
Mhm.
Spelman feeling like I did not understand art because the nearest art museum I had was the Chrysler. It was so white and so European. And so I just felt like I just don't get it. But I
Mhm.
listened to her talk a lot. And I went to, bar the first one, every single museum opening that Spelman had during my time there.
Yeah,
Because I wanted to understand. I wanted to hear the people who had curated the space talk about it.
yeah,
Sometimes, the artists themselves. And I grew in that cultural understanding, also listening to Kayla talk about her curation, and the passion that she had made me
uh-huh,
really interested. And now,
yeah,
I'm still, a lower level knowledge, but I can hold a conversation about Black art that I would have never been able to hold before I met her, before we became friends, and before we shared that passion with each other.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and again, like those are things that, like for a time in African American history and culture, that just was a part of what it meant to be educated and
Yeah.
to receive education. So, right, one of the people that I know from Southview Cemetery Board, he was telling me, Mr. Bird, he told me that his wife was surprised when, or maybe it was like the wife's, like a family member, a younger family member, it had to be, was surprised that he understood where the musicians were placed in an orchestra.
Yeah.
So he said, well, when I was a kid growing up and you went to see the orchestra, you didn't just go and listen. A
Yeah.
part of going was that you were hearing where the oboes were, like,
Yeah.
where the violinists were, where the harpists were. Like that was a part of the experience. And that's what, like, that was a part of my experience too. You didn't just go, right?
Yeah.
I
No, you
mean, you
experience, you
learned.
learn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And right, like, so a part of my occasions experience would be about that, which is
Yeah.
generally why I appreciate international studies majors. They tend to be
Mhm.
so clear about
Mhm.
what they think an educated person should be able to do
Yeah.
or should have as a part of their repertoire.
Yeah.
So generally, I knew those students because they were applying for Fulbright and they wanted to go to medical school, but they
Mm.
thought that the STEMs required so many classes that it was too hard for them to do study abroad into the depth that they wanted to. So like you could do it,
Absolutely.
but it would be like a few weeks. But
Yeah.
it was like two full experiences.
Yeah.
So this idea though of like what you take to be an educated person,
Yeah.
it isn't about just getting to the end. And these kids who do these fellowships, you're more successful when you have a sense of how you think your education needs this experience in
Yeah.
order to make you a fuller, rounder human being,
Exactly.
citizen, student, having a full
Exactly. And
appreciation
that's
for that.
also a key thing that they're looking for. They're not looking for necessarily someone who has walked a straight path that says,
Yeah.
I always knew I wanted to be a lawyer. I studied political science. I interned at a law office. They're looking for somebody who might have branched out and found different ways to pull various contexts into their interest in law and say, hey, I'm interested in going over and studying environmental science because I'm really interested and passionate in eco law and water justice. And I feel like that's an important way. So when you're thinking about applying to Marshall Rhodes Fulbright, don't necessarily think, well, I have to apply for a degree that lines up with my major. Because what
Yeah.
they're looking for is, like you said, international studies have these different ideas of what it means to be educated and what it
Mhm.
means to be knowledgeable, both within your field and as a person, a thinker in the world. So that's a
Yeah.
really important part of it too.
Yeah. And like you have a sense of what the gap is that you're looking to fill. Like,
Yeah.
one of the people that was so impressive to me was that young woman who won out of Ole Miss, who then went on to unionize at Starbucks. And like
Yeah.
when she was in an undergraduate, one of her professors said, look, this was the most like interesting, talented student I had ever met. And again, what did she do? She read. So what
Yeah.
first impressed him was that she knew who he was because
Mhm.
she had read about him and she knew that his scholarship was involved with unions. And so
Yeah.
so it was like, okay, what all everything that I could learn about it in the classroom, out in the world. So then going to this program was about these people could help fill this gap in my
Yeah.
knowledge about
Yeah.
unions and how to unionize.
Yeah.
So like also like you wanted to know like how is it that they can build these Black characters so that they
Yeah.
are full and complete? How do they do that over there in a way that we can't do it? So you're looking for them to give you like teach me how to do this thing you're doing so well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I
Mhm.
think it's funny too. That was one of the things that drew me to you, actually. I had done research on your writing and I had saw that you had written about Venus and Serena Williams. And beyond being an awesome sports fan, I thought it was really interesting how you frame them not just as like people walking down the street, but figures in a kind of larger system. And a lot of my research was taking humans, real people, and understanding how we can translate that to figures in a larger system, whether that's the system of sports, the system of Black womanhood and race, the system of a story. And
Yeah.
so that was really interesting to me because I saw your work as being that of a storyteller.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's it. Like, listen, and it sounds so simple,
Yeah.
but when someone comes to you and says, look, I read this thing, uh, you're like, what you did?
Yeah.
I mean, like that was the thing that she had done that was so impressive. And it
Mhm.
sounds like a small thing, but it's remarkable when someone says that to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it really does stand out.
Yeah.
So like that work that you do on behalf of the fellowship, to me, that's what actually can position our students to be successful. Is
Yeah.
because we're actually built for you to do that kind of work.
Yeah.
Like that's the way it is.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So
Yeah.
yeah, like you could do it and benefit from it even beyond the fellowship. Because if you don't get it, it'll still work for graduate school
Exactly, because
in
you
the
learn
US.
so much about yourself, what you're actually
Yeah.
interested and passionate about, because these applications are tough. You're gonna have to write and find many different creative ways to say essentially the same thing.
Yeah.
And what it
Yeah.
does is it actually creates these kind of pockets of questions for you. Well, why am
Yeah.
I interested in this part of character? Well, what do
Yeah.
I think the connection between poetry and screenwriting might be? And
Yeah.
so in that process, even if you come out of it not necessarily successful on the fellowship end, you come
Yeah.
out of it knowing so much more about yourself, your research, et cetera, that will lend itself further down the line in many different ways.
That's it. So true. So true. All right. Well, look, thank you so much. I'm going to stop this here. And
Yeah,
of course,
thank
I'll share
you.
this with you, but hang on. So I'm going to stop it. Thank you.